All right, here we are in part 2 of our mini-series about God's will. I apologize at the time of this recording, my allergies are out of control. I think already I've got my box of tissues right here, so let's just jump into it, shall we? In part 1, we talked about how God's will is a term that's used to describe three different things. There was God's will of desire, there's God's will of decree, and God's will of direction. And usually when people talk about God's will, they're talking about God's will of direction. And we talked about how there are two views on God's will of direction. View number one, God has a specific plan for the details of our lives that He reveals, or we must discover, ahead of time. That's the key, ahead of time, so that we can follow the plan. View two, God doesn't intend to tell us ahead of time His will, right? He wants us to make decisions that are wise and within His will of desire, but He's like, hey, you can choose, right? You can choose. As long as it's within, God's moral will, God's will of desire, you can choose. And so He's not going to tell you what to do. I want to share with you a bit of our Portugal story, and as I do that, listen and see if you can tell me which view I hold to. Mara and I were happy here in Panama, and then it happened one early fall day in 2007. I was at home reading a magazine, and as I was leafing through this magazine, a Christian magazine, there was an article about prayer, and because that's one of my hot topics, I decided to read it. What the article was really about was about how the team in Portugal was praying and asking God to give them 4 different types of people. And as I was reading down through the article, I was thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And when they described the first type of person they were asking God to give them for their team, I was like, wow, that is not me. And then I read the second type of person, like, that is not me either. Wow. And it wasn't like I was trying to, put myself into that. But I was engaging as I went along. Anyways, I get to the 4th person that they're describing, and this thought hit me that I never saw coming. That could be you. And it so freaked me out. I took the magazine, just like threw it. I was like, whoa, where did that thought come from? I later picked up the magazine, and a bit of time went by, and I gave the article to Mara, and I said, hey, why don't you read this? And she didn't expect or suspect anything, because I do that to her from time to time. So she read it, and I'm like, oh, okay. What'd you think? And she said, well, that it was an okay article, but as they were describing the 4 types of people they were looking for, that 4th type, it's like they took our resume and turned it into a magazine article. That could be us. I was like, oh boy. I don't know a lot about missionary stories, but I think this is how they get started. That was the beginning of a crazy journey. 15 months later, approximately, our family took a trip to Portugal to check out the lay of the land, if you will, meet with a bunch of people, see what God had for us. And our prayer was that God would make it clear to all 5 of us if this is what God wanted us to do. The first 4 days of our trip were awful. Not going to get into all that, but on day 5, I sat down with my journal to kind of go through and review what it was that God had said to us over the previous 15 months. I've got my journal here with me. I'm going to look at it a little bit with you, but that requires my glasses, so let's grab those too, shall we? Mara and I sat down to write out and review what God was saying through the 4 main ways that God speaks. First, the Word. As we reviewed what we had read in our quiet time over the past year and heard in sermons, patterns emerged. Over and over, Mara was struck by the word go, and I was struck by the word sent. Many times I read about how God had purchased for Himself people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And while here, God directed me to John chapter 12, verses 24 to 26, and Mark 8, 34 to 35. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. Where Jesus is, His servants must be also. And to those who seek to save their lives will lose it, but those who lose it for His sake and the gospel will find it. Prayer. Most of the time when we prayed, God was silent or told us to wait or obey His instructions. However, when He did speak, it was always like He was telling us to go. On one particular occasion, I remember I prayed and just said, God, I really, really would love to hear from you today. Is it your will that we go or not? And I opened up my devotional for the day, and the opening line was this: God commands you to go, you need permission to stay. Interesting. Way number 3, godly counsel. We reviewed the counsel that we'd received, and then in my journal I list out 12 different places we'd gone for counsel, and how all of them had said, yeah, we see it looks like God is in this. Circumstances. There were a pile of circumstances pointing toward Portugal before we left, and since coming here are several more. As we looked at that, we're like, well, Word of God, prayer, counsel, circumstances, all saying the same thing. I guess we're going. So we sat down, our kids, and I began to review with our children the things that I had just journaled out, looking through our journal from the previous year. And I got about 2/3 of the way through it. And Alyssa interrupted me and said, Dad, how clear do you need it to be? So as you listen to our story, which view are you hearing expressed? View 1, right? I'm seeking God's will. I want to be in the center of God's will. I want to do what God has for me. And I'm expecting that God is going to reveal it to me through His Word, through prayer, through counsel, and through circumstances. That's the view. But here's the thing that we talked about last week. We want our view to match what the Scriptures are actually saying. So let's look at several verses that are used by both sides in this debate and just see what they have to say to us. First verse, Psalm 143, verse 10. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your gracious Spirit lead me on level ground. Is David asking God to reveal His will of direction? Is that when he says, teach me to do your will? He's like, God, reveal your will of direction to me. I need to know, is it direction A, direction B? Is that what David's talking about? Or is it a different will? Well, it's certainly not the will of decree. God never reveals that to us ahead of time, right? That we just look and see what happens. That's how we know. What is it? Is it the will of direction? No, this is the will of desire. David is saying, teach me to do your will. Literally, God, teach me to do your wishes or your desires. David wants God to reveal to him the way of righteousness. Of course, David didn't have anywhere near the Bible that you and I have, and that's the primary way that, right, we're going to know God's will of desire, right? It's going to come through the Scriptures. David didn't have all that, but David had a heart for God, and so he said, God, teach me to do your will. Teach me your ways. Teach me your wishes and your desires. So this is a verse really about God's will of desire, or God's moral will. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 17, the next verse on our list. It says, so don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. I've heard this verse used as a command to discover God's will of direction. Like, don't be a fool, right? Figure out what God is revealing to you, or discover God's will of direction and then do it. Always a good rule of thumb. You read a verse, go back and look at the context. So we're going to do that. The context for verse 17 begins back in verse 15. So let's read it together. Pay careful attention then to how you walk. Not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. So don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. The context here is live wisely. Paul is telling us to embrace what pleases the Lord by applying God's desires to our choice. He's like, listen, this is no time for foolishness. By foolishness, he's talking about acting without thinking, right? The days that we have here on earth are limited. So this is no time to be a fool and living according to our fleshly desires. This is the time to live according to God's desires, doing what God would have us to do. Primarily, Paul is then talking about what God's will of desire, God's moral will. This passage, if you want to see a similar one, go to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. Paul makes the same case. Colossians 1, verses 9 to 10. For this reason also, since the day we heard this, we haven't stopped praying for you. We're asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, so that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and growing in the knowledge of God. Again, which will of God is this verse referring to? Is it God's will of decree? No. God's will of desire? Yeah, it certainly looks like that, doesn't it? God's will of direction? No, it doesn't seem to be that. Paul is saying, we're praying that you will be filled with the knowledge of His will. We're praying that you're going to be filled with a knowledge of what it is that pleases God. In all wisdom, he says. Wisdom. What's wisdom here? The ability to use knowledge. And then he says also with spiritual understanding. That's insight. So what Paul is praying, he says, is, guys, I want you to know God's will. In other words, I want you to know God's moral will, God's will of desire. I want you to know what pleases God. Plus have the wisdom, the ability to use that knowledge and the insight to know when to use which principle, right? So that you can walk in a way that is pleasing to God, bearing fruit, right? Having insight to know, like, what do I do now? What's best next? That kind of thing. This is primarily another text about God's moral will or God's will of desire. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, a well-known passage. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways know Him, and He'll make your paths straight. Some translations translate verse 6 this way: in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Some people think that this verse teaches that we're not to trust our ability to make wise choices. No, right? Don't trust in your own. Don't rely or trust your own understanding, right? But instead, look for God to direct us. And at first brush, you could come to that conclusion. But let me ask you, is that what this passage says? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is in the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs is a wisdom book that extols the value of gaining and using wisdom, right? That's the context. It's a book all about gaining wisdom and using that wisdom to make decisions and to do God's will. And Proverbs teaches that there's good understanding and there's bad understanding. And the difference between the good understanding and the bad understanding starts with knowing God and His ways, right? Proverbs says the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So good understanding is wisdom or understanding that starts with God exists and God is awesome and I will never ever dishonor or disobey God. And then there's bad understanding. That starts with I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to pursue my own ends. I'm going to be what I want to be, right? And the writer of Proverbs is saying, listen, trust in the Lord, right? Trust God. Trust His will. Trust His ways. That's good understanding. Don't lean on the bad understanding. In all your ways, know God. Put your knowledge of God at the foundation of every decision you make. It's kind of like years ago there was this bracelet. It came from a saying, right? But the bracelet, I remember a bunch of us having, is WWJD, what would Jesus do? Proverbs is encouraging us to do something similar. What would God do? In all your ways, know God. In every decision you're going to make, what would God do? And He'll make your paths straight. So what does the straight paths part mean? It's a contrast to the crooked and the perverse ways of the wicked. If you read through Proverbs, you'll see that over and over again. When it talks about straight, he's talking about living the righteous life, going down the straight and narrow, if you will, versus the crooked or the perverse way, which is the wicked way. And so he's saying, listen, if you trust God always and know God, so you're constantly asking, what would God do? God will lead you in the straight and narrow path, and then you will avoid the crooked and the perverse ways of the wicked. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. So that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Oh, this is a great verse. Now, some people use Romans 12, 2 to arrive at kind of a bullseye view of God's will. You notice this said good, pleasing, and perfect. They imagine a bullseye, and on the outer ring is God's like good will, and then the middle would be pleasing, and then at the very center would be perfect, God's perfect will. And the idea is that there's this acceptable region, like you could be living and that would be the outer ring of the bullseye. You could be within God's will, but you're just in the acceptable region. And then there's the better, right, good, better part, and then there's best. And they use this verse to teach the idea of the center of God's will. This is the primary place that idea comes from. It doesn't say that, but it comes from this verse. I want to live in the center of God's will. I want to be like at the perfect part, the very, very best. I want to be like not just what God would tolerate or maybe what God would recommend, but what God has chosen for me. And then if you hold to that interpretation of this text, then you'd be going, all right, so God, I need you to reveal to me. I need you to lead me to that center that I want to hit the bullseye. Well, this isn't going to be a shock to you what we're going to do next. Let's look at the context to see if this is a verse about God's will of direction, or is this another verse about God's will of desire, and what is the meaning of Romans 12:2, part B. Let's go back to Romans 12, verse 1. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Verse 2, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Romans 12:1, we could say it this way. The message is be dedicated, right? Guys, in light of God's mercy, in light of all that God has done, is doing, be dedicated to God. How? He says, I urge you to present your bodies as living sacrifices, right? I offer every part of your body to God. Verse 2 is a different command. Verse 1 is be dedicated. Verse 2, we could say the command is to be transformed rather than be conformed. Transformed, changed from the inside out rather than conformed. Changed by pressure from without. How do we get conformed? This world, right? It puts pressure on us. We use that term, peer pressure. Presses us in from the outside to be like the world, to be like evaluating what it values, doing what it does, going where it goes, right? All that. Instead, be transformed from the inside out. How? You renew your mind. You replace the world's based beliefs and thinking habits, and then that is going to learn to discernment of God's will. With that renewed mind, we'll be able to tell what is pleasing to God. I believe this is another verse primarily about God's moral will, right? With a renewed mind, we'll be able to see things from God's perspective, and we'll know what pleases Him so that we can then live within the boundaries of God's will of desire. So what do we do with this idea then that good, pleasing, perfect, what is that? Because those are clearly adjectives describing God's will. Well, imagine it like this. Imagine that we were able to do this together, and we're just hanging out together, and I decide to serve you some food. And so I come up to you and I'm like, hey, I want to talk to you, give you some food that reminds me of God's will. You're like, okay, that's a little weird, but sure, maybe you like food. And maybe I ask you ahead of time, do you have any food allergies? And you assure me no. So here we go. And I drop in front of you a small plate of peas. And I say, God's will is like peas. Go ahead, you eat it. I'll talk, you eat, right? So God's will is like peas. And so I give you the peas. Now, I don't know if you like peas or not. I kind of like peas are okay. And lately I've gotten on the habit of eating the snow peas. I pack them in my lunch. And so I eat them, so it's got, I don't know, what do you call it, the husk and all? Whatever. And I like them. They taste just fine, although I can't get over the fact that when I was a kid, we used to shuck peas. And so we kept the little, the peas on the inside, and the shucks that we threw, we fed them to the pigs. So I eat these snow peas, but in the back of my brain, I always had this idea like I'm eating pig food. But anyway, so you're eating your peas. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk about pigs there. You're eating your peas, and I'm like, God's will is like peas. It's good for you. You know, that's the thing you always heard about vegetables. Eat your vegetables, they're good for you. God's will, God's moral will, his will desire, the things that he wants us to do and the things he wants us to avoid, God's boundaries, they are good for you. And so God's will is like peas. But he says it's not just God's good will. The next phrase is pleasing. And so while you're eating your peas, all of a sudden I drop on your plate the next thing, a nice hot slice of Domino's pizza. And you're probably thinking, now we're talking. Maybe if you haven't finished your peas, you push them off to the side. Because God's will is like pizza. It's pleasing. It's good for you, hooray, but it's pleasing. Like I would rather eat, I don't know about you, but I would rather eat a good piece of pizza than some peas. When we were in Portugal, we couldn't get pepperoni and stuff like that. So I still, like, when we do pizza, I take pepperoni and I put a fair amount on there. I love it because it's pleasing, right? So you're eating your pizza now, and I'm like, God's will is like pizza. So it's like peas, it's good for you, but it's like pizza and it's pleasing. Like, yeah, bring it on. I'm thinking about another piece. But I don't give you another piece of pizza. Instead, I hand you a piece of pie. I don't know what kind of pie you like. My dad only likes two kinds of pie, hot and cold. And you could give him pie with ice cream if you wanted. So let's assume that that's what I gave you. I gave you your favorite kind of pie, and I've got a nice scoop of ice cream there on the side. God's will is like peas. God's will is like pizza. God's will is like pie. This is perfect, right? Perfect. You end the meal with the perfect dessert, and you're like, oh, yeah, now we're talking, right? Now we're talking peas. Okay, that's good for me. Pizza, that was pleasing. Pie, that's perfect. God's moral will is like that. God's will of desire is good in that it is good for us. It helps us to avoid all the contaminants and all the nasty stuff. It builds strength within us and moral resolve, right? It is good for us. It is pleasing. Over time, as we do God's moral will, we'll come to a point where we realize, this really is the way to live. This really is the way to live. And I am so glad that God has revealed it to me. But then it's not only that, as we walk with the Lord and we experience that unhindered relationship with him, doing God's moral will, his will of desire, we come to the point where we're like, you know what, God, your ways aren't just good for me. And they're not just pleasing. There is nothing better. There's nothing better. That I would never want to live outside of your moral will, because there is nothing better. God, your moral will, your will of desire is perfect. It's just absolutely perfect. I think that's the point that he's making here. That with discernment, we will come to really understand and know and be able to apply God's moral will to our lives. And that's a great thing, because through experience we learn that God's moral will is good, it is pleasing, and it is perfect. It is peas, it is pizza, it is pie a la mode. So back to our Portugal story. We came back from Portugal there in November of 2008 with the revelation that God wanted us to go to Portugal. And so all right, it's obedience time, right? We're going to obey God, and we are going to prepare to go to Portugal. And prepare we did. We went to ABWE and went through missionary training, did some other things. Fast forward, it's now the summer of 2011, and our support is coming in. We're getting closer and closer to 100%, but we're not at 100%. And I am praying like crazy to God. God, I need to know, do we buy tickets? Do we go now or not? Because the school year is starting very soon. I need to know. And I am pleading with God. I need to know. And God was silent, absolutely silent. And I'm just freaking out. every day that gets closer to like time when it's decision time, and I hear nothing from God, I am freaking out. I am in the Word. I'm talking to godly counselors. I'm praying. I'm trying to read the circumstances. They're not convincing because we're not at 100%, but it is slowly inching up, and I'm like freaking out. So we were down at ABW headquarters. And I ended up meeting with my boss, and I told him, man, I'm freaking out. I do not know what to do, and I'm in a near panic because I have to do what God wants me to do, and God isn't speaking to me. And he just kind of sat there and looked across the desk, and he looked at me, and he's like, what? I'm like, I need to know. I need to know God's will. I need to know what God wants me to do because I got to get this right. I'm going to move my entire family and I'm going to leave my church and we're going to do all that. I have got to get this right, and I need God to reveal His will. I need God to speak, and He's not, and I don't know what to do. And he's just like, what? And he realizes like, oh, I'm one of those view one guys. And it became very apparent over the next couple minutes that he was not a view one guy on God's will direction. He was very much a view two. And he's like, Andy, that's not how it works at all. He's like, that's not how it works. God doesn't tell us what to do every step of the time. He wants us to make wise choices, and we're never 100% sure. He's like, if I'm 80% sure, that's great. And I'm like, what? Now I'm looking at him like he's wacky, right? I'm like, 80% sure? I would never do anything if I was only 80% sure. And he's like, what? You 100%? How are you going to be 100%? God doesn't work that way, you're right? And we're looking at each other. And he began to really, really challenge me. View one was my view of God's will and how God's will direction, how it works. And it left me in this crisis when it was time to choose to go to Portugal. And God did not speak in the couple weeks that followed that. And so I eventually made the choice, and I bought tickets. Whether it's the right choice or not, this I know. God went with us every step of the way. Was it hard? Oh, yeah. Did I do some things that made this like practically insane? Yeah, absolutely. If I had to do it over again, would I change some things? Yes. Would I still have gone? Absolutely. And God was with us every step of the way. The days and months and years after that, I began to compare my thoughts about God's will of direction with the scriptures and became, shall we say, more suspicious of view one. By the way, before I tell you where I'm at today, let me say one other thing that's really, really huge we don't want to miss. I am so impressed with God. I do believe with all my heart God was leading us to go to Portugal, and I still believe that God leads. I believe that God was leading us to go to Portugal. But here's what's so awesome to me about that was that God was leading me in a way that I would recognize it to be the voice of God. Whether or not God prefers to work through view one or not, He knew that's how I operated, and he led in a view one kind of way for us to get us where we should be and where it was going to be good for us to be, good for us, good for the kingdom, right? And good for God's glory. I am so impressed with God that He would lead and speak in a manner that I would recognize to be His voice. Whether that's His preferred method of doing it or not, God was being God, the good, gracious God who is leading us. So where I'm at today with this whole will of direction thing, I believe that most decisions are wisdom decisions. So basically view two with exceptions, right? That most of the time God expects us to use wisdom and make wisdom decisions. Yeah, I'll always stick within God's moral will, God's will desire, but use your head, right? And make wise decisions. Once in a while, this is why I say I'm view two with exceptions. Once in a great while, I think God does want me to do something very specific, like going to Portugal. And when He does, God always makes it very, very clear. And when He makes it clear, then it's an obedience decision, not a wisdom decision. So most decisions are wisdom decisions, but there are a few obedience decisions. But I really believe those are the exception. We could chat more about that if you want, and I look forward to maybe getting into it a little bit more in part 3 of our series. But here's where I want to leave you. We can get fixated on God's will, like the will is the super important part, and it is important. Where I want to leave you is this. I want to leave you the most important part, God. God is awesome. God is awesome. His will of desire is good, is pleasing, and perfect. Let that sink in. God has a will, a moral will for us, and his moral will is good and pleasing and perfect, and he reveals that to us through his word. That is awesome, and that awesomeness comes from a God who is awesome. God leads us. I do believe that. He leads us, and when we ask him for wisdom, he often will give us wisdom. That wisdom comes from a God who is just plain awesome. God allows us to make real choices. That is awesome. Our choices really matter. We really can choose A or B, and our choices have different consequences. Those are real choices, not like playing a game with us or pretending with us. You're like, okay, you can choose, but you're not really getting to choose. And that ability to make real choices comes from a God who is awesome. And when I think about the awesomeness of God, it's no wonder that our new hearts want to know God and do his will, whatever it is. So friends, I want to encourage you, be on a quest such that whatever your view on God's will of direction is, make sure that it squares with the scriptures. We'll see you back here for the conclusion of this little mini-series on God's will.